So, what is the culture war anyway? This is Dispatches from the Culture War. I'm MD Perkins. And today I wanted to define this very complicated and complex concept of the culture war. I don't know of a topic that garners more animus and action and controversy than the question of how should Christians be engaged in culture. And there are competing ideas about what it means to be the church, what it means to be a Christian, how we should be interacting in society, what role should we have in politics as Christians. And of course, I'm speaking of this from an American perspective, as most of these conversations that I'm seeing and probably you're seeing are happening within an American context. But the question is, why are Christians resistant to this? What are the objections that they have? And so today I want to take a little time to talk about this idea of the culture war. I directed a documentary called Don Wildman and the Battle for Decency, Culture Warrior, that you see back there, culturewarrior.movie. You can go watch it for free. But the idea of, I dug into the history of Don. So there's a historical facet to the culture war that I'm examining in that movie. But to look at it through his perspective and to understand his approach, I found to be particularly helpful and enlightening. Even though I work for American Family Association, I'm involved in the ministry here, it doesn't matter. I mean, it's easy to lose sight of the ball. It's easy to forget your roots and where you're coming from. It's easy to forget the initial arguments that were put out there because, quite frankly, the way that the mainstream media treats Christians' involvement in culture and society from a conservative point of view is very dismissive and will always tend to treat it in a way that is unfair, unjust, and misrepresents. And then other Christians hear that and begin to shape their own viewpoint based on the information they're receiving from these other sources. So, first, what is the culture war? This is actually an important question because the word culture war is just thrown around very loosely. And it's really more of a vibe word. It implies something. It moves people to action. It makes people feel certain ways. It's an image-based word. And it's become that increasingly, where it's essentially just a type of branding, where maybe people who are interested in the culture war hear that and they understand it and they're rallied to action and they're excited about it. And people who are opposed to the culture war hear it and they have certain images and pictures in their mind. And I mean, some of the pictures that people may have in their mind is just a fundamentalist preacher, like preaching against, the Cold War, like in the 80s or something, preaching about Russia and communism or something like that. Or people might think of Christians standing outside of an abortion clinic with picket signs and think that is what the culture war is. I think everybody has some image in their mind when the phrase culture war is dropped out there that they are thinking about and quite often reacting against. And I think there's probably two pictures. One, for those who are interested in the culture war or agreeable to it at some level, the image in your mind is some image of the wickedness and the evil that exists in the world and the threat that it poses to children or society at large. So think of like the LGBT movement. And so maybe you picture pride flag. And so pride flag becomes culture war. So when you hear culture war, you think of the encroachment of LGBT ideology within many facets of American society, from law and government to medicine and education, media, entertainment, sports, all these different areas in which we've seen the increased visibility as well as the normalization of homosexuality, transgenderism, LGBTQ. So that's one side. But there's another side, which is you see Christians or people who claim to be Christians arguing. Maybe you envision just someone online. And so you think of certain kind of person on social media, on Facebook, on Instagram, wherever, arguing and debating issues, and doesn't really seem that gracious, doesn't really seem that convincing. It just seems like a person's kind of bitter and angry. And so I think people tend to lump in one or the other group based on probably, a lot of pre-existing factors. But the reality is, a lot of our response to this question of the culture war is foundationally just our own sensibility. It's a sensibility thing. We feel a sense of this or we feel a sense of that. And when you read the objections that Christians have written against culture war and the culture war ideology or mentality, you'll read a lot of stuff about vibe. Like they feel like things are this way or that people are acting this way, and they'll speak in generalities. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But what is the culture war actually? Well, the definition that I've come up with is that the culture war essentially is a battle of ideas. And it's a battle of ideas that's taking place in society. And so what are some of the questions and what are some of the big themes that are connected to this concept of the culture war? Well, I've got quite a few listed out here, actually. So, truth. What is true? That question, what is true? That's a big question that we face. Values. What is good? Aesthetics. What is beautiful? Think about worldview. What fundamental presuppositions do people bring to different conversations and aspects of culture and society? And also, with that, what fundamental presuppositions do institutions have or are they operating under? It's a question of worldview. How are people thinking? What is the lens that they're using to understand and judge these prior questions of truth, values, and aesthetics? Question of validity. Which voices should we listen to? A question of normalcy. What is normal, and who or what defines what normal is? A question of flourishing. What leads to the best outcomes for people? Because we're going to get into questions of politics, policy, the implications of certain decisions. And so people are asking questions of flourishing and harm. Flourishing, what leads to the best outcomes for people? And then the question of harm. What is harmful or threatening to people? And how does that impact children in particular? And the question of children's involvement in all of this. There's also the question of interpretation. What does all of this actually mean? What is behind certain statements and arguments that are being put out there? Because there's the statement itself, but then there's kind of a way that someone would frame it to present an allegiance to a certain position or a certain other person, party, nation. All of these things are playing out in our culture and society. The question of interpretation. The question of bellwethers. Which things are truly predictive of future dangers? We'll have arguments over this because the question is, when we see something, we often think of it as indicative or predictive, perhaps, of something else that will be happening in short order or sometime in the future. As a result of this one thing, there's other things that are attached to that. So the question of bellwethers is important. The question of priorities. What should be our focus? What should we be focused on right now? What should be our priorities? Where should this fall in the list of priorities? And then the question of strategies. What is the best approach to deal with this? And will it work? So when we're talking about the questions of the culture war, you can see that it's a really big topic. It encompasses all aspects of our life, our culture, our society. And so to act as if it is merely a political thing, and I'm kind of jumping ahead and dealing with one of the first objections, when you think of it purely as political, I don't think you're doing justice to the full spectrum of what we're talking about and what is at stake. And so that's where I would want to answer the question of what is the culture war. The culture war is a battle of ideas, and these ideas touch on every aspect of who we are, how we relate, how society is structured, what will be our sense of normal, what is good, what is right, what is true. All of these issues, all of those questions are touched by the question of the culture war. And to give a different definition, there's a guy named Josh Wood who works with a group called Them Before Us. You might have heard of the name Katie Faust, excellent speaker. Well, Josh Woods is the I believe the executive director of Them Before Us, has an excellent Substack that he has, and he recently sent out something called Christians in the Culture War, a field guide to the fight you're already in. And I just want to highlight that subtitle, the fight that you're already in. That's an important thing to understand about the culture war, is a lot of people give the impression that Christians went out and decided to pick a fight with the culture. But what was happening and what has happened historically, and we talk about it in the movie Culture Warrior as well, is that you had American society, Western civilization was built under an understanding of the Christian view of man, that man was inherently sinful, that there were restraints that needed to be put in place, but at the same time, man was dignified, he had value and worth because he was created in God's image, and so that led to a lot of the values of Western society that we enjoy and celebrate, including things like free speech, the right to life, and all of these different rights that we talk about as benefits of our society. Those weren't born in a vacuum. Those came out of a Christian understanding of mankind, man's role, man's relationship to God, and then government's role on top of man. And so when we talk about a culture war, we're talking about something historically that actually happened, took place in time, where essentially there was a switcheroo that happened, where new progressive ideas were established while the Christian underpinnings to those values were removed. And this happened through the influence of mainline liberalism on the mainline churches, theological liberalism, I mean. And that had implications on the broader aspects of society, to where you create a secular society. You try and remove the understandings of those underpinnings, those foundation points that were actually the context of this society. And you remove those things while maintaining the benefits of the fruit of Christian thinking and the Christian worldview. So you maintain aspects of that, but that's really a very flimsy thing. It's a house of cards, and that's what you began to see throughout the 20th century, was that house of cards beginning to crumble and fall down because the foundation underneath it had been removed, and that is a Christian understanding of these things. So that's the historical context. So when we say the fight that you're already in, that's also, like Billy Joel, we didn't start the fire. These things happened before us, and there was already hostility that was there. And what happened was many Christians were sidelined. You can go back to the history of the fundamentalist modernist controversy in the early part of the 20th century if you want to understand the history of Christians retreating from active involvement in culture and society and politics. But that was something that was slow to turn around. And on the evangelical front, that was something that really emerged in the late 1970s. And so that's the historical context. But what is another definition of the culture war that we could give? Well, I think Josh Wood gives a good one here. He says the culture war is the public struggle over what is true, what is good, and what is normal, and which institutions will teach, protect, and enforce those answers. And he goes on to say that makes the battlefield basically everything: politics and courts, schools and syllabi, media and tech platforms, family life and social norms, workplaces and the wider economy, the stories we tell our children, and the rules we enforce in public. Every policy, curriculum, and platform trains someone's sense of what counts as acceptable. You've heard that phrase, you can't legislate morality, which is not accurate. Morality is always legislated because morality sets the bar for what is good, what is right, what is true, what should normal be, and what should our response as a society be to those things. Hopefully that's helpful and clarifying. Hopefully it cuts through some of the clutter in this conversation. It is a big topic. There's a lot of things connected to it. But when people just throw it out there as a term, I think we need to recognize that there's more to it than that. And let's begin by understanding the terms of our discourse before we begin objecting to certain aspects of it or just using this concept as a glittering generality, which is really a propaganda term because it's vague, it evokes emotion, it calls and stirs people to action, but it doesn't really mean very much individually, and the definition behind why you're using that is not clearly stated. So this helps us move beyond glittering generalities and be able to get to the heart of this actual conversation before we get started. So thank you for taking the time to watch. We'll see you next time.